Good afternoon, and this lesson is about chapter 16, making arguments. That being said, let's get you going on this chapter. And let me share with you the screen. That always takes longer than it should. You always wonder who makes arguments? Well, basically, everyone and their mother makes arguments, especially when it comes to persuasion in today's society. Obviously, lawyers make arguments and persuasive actions, sales representatives as well. Public relations specialists, they normally have to put out what's called fires of their clients. And when that happens, they have to persuade who they need that something in order for good. Also counselors and administrators. If you think about it, your academic counselor, advisor tries to persuade you to take specific classes or persuade you to not take specific classes. So those types of people, those types of professions are typically ones in terms of persuasion for today's society, as well as many others. But those are just a few examples. In this chapter, you will learn how to define argument and explain it in its three basic parts. Describe also Aristotle's theory of persuasion. That is what chapter 16 also does for you. Chapter 16 also explains the three major types of claims and their differences, because there are three, one of which will be used more so in a persuasive argument. And this chapter also describes the most common types of fallacies. I'm sure you know already a few off the top of your head, but there is a fairly decent laundry list of fallacies that you do need to be aware of when you are making arguments. This chapter talks about understanding informal logic. We basically go through formal logic and its analytical study of reasoning processes, and it's frequently limited to rigorous examination of propositions and their meanings. But then there is such a thing that is called informal logic, and it concerns the study of how people argue on an everyday basis by leaving some things unstated. The key to understanding everyday arguments is noticing what is assumed or not said. It's almost as if leaving something hidden that makes you think that there's not enough logic in their reasoning to go through this argument. Reasoning. It's the process of drawing a conclusion based on the evidence. Sometimes we reason well, and sometimes not so well, as when we conclude that ice particles forming on the trees may mean that the roads may be slippery. Other times we reason just a little less effectively, as when we conclude that spilling salt will bring bad luck. Most superstitions, I should say, are actually no more than instances of faulty reasoning. You would get someone that would try to argue on something that has less stats, no stats, less figures, no figures. And so that tends to draw us to wonder whether or not what they're trying to argue is really does really have enough reasoning, and therefore is it actually an argument at all. There is such a thing that is called deductive reasoning, making inferences or coming to conclusions based on the general public or law. Reasoning from something that is very general to very specific. Think of it that way. The classic example is penguins are flightless birds. Bob's a penguin, therefore Bob can't fly, even though he is a bird. So went from a general with birds, flightless birds, to Bob, who's a little bit more specific, to making that type of reasoning. Deductive, going down the ladder. Then there is such a thing that is inductive reasoning, making inferences or conclusions about a general principle or law based on particles or specifics. Reasoning that is going from a specific to a general. Arguments that then suggest or use analogies are inductive in character. So here's a really good one that's in today's society. Canada has socialized medicine. Denmark also has socialized medicine. Both Canada and Denmark have very high taxes to help pay for those healthcare systems. Therefore, if the US socialized healthcare, taxes will have to be increased to help pay for it. Now, again, those are very specifics, and then it went into a much more broader reasoning. It doesn't mean that that's right, but it is some sort of inductive reasoning. Because what's different with, obviously, we're looking at politics in this matter, or healthcare medicine, is how our taxes come into play. Or basically, our numbers are very different than Denmark and Canada. But you get an understanding and an idea where these very specifics go into a much broader spectrum of reasoning. Now, the book talks about three means of persuasion claims. A claim that's factual, a statement that asserts that something has happened, is happening, or will happen, is, was, or in the future. So the statement that asserts that something is true, X is Y. That is a persuasive fact claim. Then the second one is a persuasion claim of value, a statement that asserts that something is good or bad. So when you make the claim, it's either going to be a value of good or bad. Then your third one is of policy. That's a third persuasion claim. A policy asserts that something should or should not change, happen, or to be done in the future. Policy is something that when you make that claim, it's a far better way to make an argument. It is more of an active way to make a claim and an active argument versus a claim of fact or a claim of value. The book then goes into fallacies, using unclear or incorrect facts, incomplete evidence, erroneous reasoning for that matter, biased samplings. Stats and facts are not fully repped of the entire population. They'll probably take a small portion. That's considered biased sampling, as opposed to a much more broader and a more generalized population. So let's just say we took a sampling of students regarding student parking, where we only took a sampling of people's opinions of this class in particular, when that fully did not represent the entire student body. You're only getting 30 samplings as opposed to 30,000. And I know I'm making a huge, huge statement when it comes to that because I don't know the entire student body of Wayne State, but that is just, again, a biased sampling. The book also goes into hasty generalizations, and the speaker draws a faulty conclusion from extreme exceptions and limited evidence. So here's a list of logical fallacies. It kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but it's like you think about these, oh, it sounds right, but in fact, it's a fallacy. Attacking the person, you're appealing to ignorance, you're appealing to authority, you've got appeal to emotion, false analogies, slanting, you've heard of straw man, you've heard two wrongs make a right, you've got division, you've got false dilemmas, all those types. So you can always come back to this and look at it just a little bit more to understand your logical fallacies. Now, we've talked about claims. Now we're going to talk about propositions, and they're the same three: fact, value, and policy. When you're making an argument, do you make an argument of a proposition or a fact? It's very similar to informative. Your organizational pattern when it comes to your outline and how you choose to formulate your speech can be topical or can be chronological. Each main point in your speech will present a reason why someone should agree with you. You're basically stating a fact. And remember, that fact can always stand alone. It should be independent and not rely on any other fact. It shouldn't be independent. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be codependent on another fact. Those facts should stand alone. Now, when it comes to a proposition of fact, unlike an informative speech in which the facts shared with an audience are more or less agreed upon by most people, persuasive speeches when it comes to a proposition of fact will orbit some degree of uncertainty. To get more of specifics, just go to your page 327. When it comes to a clear warrant and a claim of fact, look at this example. Having a healthcare plan can help you pay for services you cannot otherwise afford. Now you have that sentence, and then you insert evidence, a stat or a fact. Then you go into, for example, if you paid emergency root canal out of your pocket, it could run you $1,000 or more. But with a good dental plan, the procedure would run you about $500. So the warrant is a healthcare plan saves you money by cutting your healthcare expenses. When you make a proposition of value, that's about judgments, that's about your beliefs on what's right or what's wrong, what's good or what's bad, what's moral or what's immoral, fair or unfair. And again, your organizational pattern could be topical as well. We always talk about whether something is good or bad, worthless or ideal. I mean, they have this argument right here. Basketball is an ideal sport because you want to make sure that you persuade someone that that's the best way for exercise and it's the most ideal sport. And then you can start comparing it if you want, whether you want to use an organizational pattern of topical or comparative, how one sport is better than the other. So that's a proposition of value. But the biggest one in terms of making an argument and the most effective one is a proposition of policy. It goes beyond the questions of fact or value. If anything, policy brings in fact or value into your argument, but it also decides whether something should be done or not done. You can actually make an argument that something shouldn't be done, or make an argument saying that something should be done or shouldn't be done. And it all has to do with a policy matter. When put formally, questions of policy usually include the word should, or as in these examples. What measures should you be taken to protect people's privacies online? Should the Electoral College be abolished? And what steps should you take to reduce the erosion of America's coastlines? Those particular words and phrases are very forceful, and it goes in line when it comes to making an argument about a policy. Those words should never be used in an informative speech because those words, again, you don't want to use words that are biased. But when it comes to making an argument, especially when it comes to a proposition of policy, you use very specific words and very deliberate language. So that way you can make your proposition come across that more effectively. When it comes to propositions of policy, you can try and make a passive agreement. Policy is desirable, but you will not necessarily encourage that audience to do anything to enact that policy. Or in order to gain immediate attention, what you want to do is motivate your audience to take some form of action. Sign a petition for abolishing the Electoral College, lower the cost of school tuition, a fund drive, or whatever the case is. Remember, your attempt and your need to draw them in is to give them a statement of relevance as to why they should listen to you. And again, that last sentence, what's in it for them? The statement of relevance is always important, or your audience will tune out. And of course, just give you a blank stare. You always have to ask that question for yourself. What's in it for me? What's in it for them? Why should they listen? And once you formulate that question, you place that question into your argument as part of your policy. Again, proposition of policy actually can use Monroe's motivated sequence. In your introduction, you want to draw attention to a matter that you want changed. From that point forward, you tell your audience the need for that change. You then go into visualization. You basically hypothetically help your audience visualize the change that can happen. You then go into action, the actions that you and your audience need to take in order to get something done. And at the very last end of your proposition of policy persuasion claim, you give them the end result of what that satisfaction can and will be. So using a Monroe's motivated sequence helps to further your argument along as to what type of topic you are persuading on. Now, analyzing questions of policy. The need. There's no need in arguing for a policy unless you show a need. Again, is there a need for more student parking on a campus? When you show that need, you have to bring that into this situation. Next, you make a plan. Once you show that the problem actually exists, you explain to them the plan for solving it. Show them the practicality. Once you've presented the plan, you must show how it will work and will it solve your problem. Then you have to go into a call of action. Again, that's part of Monroe's policy or Monroe's motivated sequence. You have got to show that the action reinforces the belief of what you have. You have to make the recommendations as specific and finite as possible. Don't just urge your listeners to do something, tell them exactly what you want them to do and how to do it. Basically, give them the steps. So that way they can, it's not so much that they don't draw their own conclusions, but you give them a better reason to draw those conclusions. Now, when you organize a speech when it comes to a proposition of policy, you can use a problem solution order. Have the specific purpose. This also shows the central, and then it shows your first main point as the problem and the second main point as your solution. This is when, in this particular thing, in this particular persuasive argument or whatever argument that you had, this is when two main points work well, one versus the other, a problem and a solution. You can actually add a third point in there, smack dab in the middle, sandwiched in, a problem, a cause, and a solution. Childhood obesity is a serious problem and it should be controlled by terms of diet and exercise. My apologies for what's going on in the background noise, but I am in my house, so this is what happens. If you look at the first main point, excuse me, childhood obesity is a huge problem in the US. There are two major causes of the increase in childhood obesity, and that's when you show the cause. And then the third one is how do you plan on solving it, and what's the fix for dealing with both of these causes? So those are ways and examples of doing that. When you do a comparative order when making an argument, you devote each main point to explaining why your solution is preferable than to the other one. The statement of the problem or the need for change, description of your problem or solution, and then of course the description of how your policy or solution is better than the other one. Now, a refutative argument or an order is when you have a pattern of debates and similar speaking situations, like in a courtroom or a legislator. And for this particular type of persuasion, you have an attempt to move an audience to accept your position by responding to refuting and opposing claims. Meaning that if you have an opposing description or a position, then you show the consequence of the latter, like what's going to happen if you go down the other way. You basically have all these, let's just say 3 claims, and then you refute the 3 of them. It's on page 330 and 331. You basically address each main point and then refute it. Let's go into this particular speech.
The last speaker for this signing ceremony is the Academy Award Best Actor and the United Nations Messenger of Peace, Mr. Leonardo DiCaprio.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for the honor to address this body once more. Thanks to the distinguished climate leaders assembled here today who are ready to take action. President Abraham Lincoln was also thinking of bold action 150 years ago when he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present, as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." He was speaking before the U.S. Congress to confront the defining issue of his time, slavery. Everyone knew it had to end, but no one had the political will to stop it. Remarkably, his words ring as true today when applied to the defining crisis of our time, climate change. As a UN messenger of peace, I've traveled all over the world for the last 2 years documenting how this crisis is changing the natural balance of our planet. I've seen cities like Beijing choked by industrial pollution, ancient boreal forests in Canada that have been clear-cut, and rainforests in Indonesia that have been incinerated. In India, I met farmers whose crops have been literally washed away by historic flooding. In America, I've witnessed unprecedented droughts in California and sea level rise flooding the streets of Miami. In Greenland and in the Arctic, I was astonished to see that ancient glaciers are rapidly disappearing, well ahead of scientific predictions. All that I have seen and learned on my journey has absolutely terrified me. There is no doubt in the world scientific community that this is a direct result of human activity, and the effects of climate change will become astronomically worse in the future. I do not need to tell you these statistics. You know them better than I do, but more importantly, you know what will happen if this scourge is left unchecked. You know that climate change is happening faster than even the most pessimistic of scientists warned us decades ago. It has become a runaway freight train, bringing with it an impending disaster for all living things. Now think about the shame that each of us will carry when our children and grandchildren look back and realize that we had the means of stopping this devastation, but simply lacked the political will to do so. Yes, we have achieved the Paris Agreement. More countries have come together here to sign this agreement today than for any other cause in the history of humankind. And that is reason for hope. But unfortunately, the evidence shows us that it will not be enough. Our planet cannot be saved unless we leave fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. An upheaval, a massive change is required right now, one that leads to a new collective consciousness, a new collective evolution of the human race, inspired and enabled by a sense of urgency from all of you. We all know that reversing the course of climate change will not be easy, but the tools are in our hands if we apply them before it is too late. Renewable energy, fossil fuels, and putting a price on carbon pollution are beginning to turn the tide. This transition is not only the right thing for our world, but it also makes clear economic sense and is possible within our lifetime. But it is now upon you to do what great leaders have always done, to lead, to inspire, and empower, as President Lincoln did in his time. We can congratulate each other today, but it will mean absolutely nothing if you return to your countries and fail to push beyond the promises of this historic agreement. Now is the time for bold, unprecedented action. My friends, look at the delegates around you. It is time to ask each other, which side of history will you be on? As a citizen of our planet who has witnessed so much on this journey, I thank you all for everything you have done to lay the foundation of a solution to this crisis. But after 21 years of debates and conferences, it is time to declare no more talk, no more excuses, no more 10-year studies, no more allowing the fossil fuel companies to manipulate and dictate the science and policies that affect our future. This is the body that can do what is needed. All of you sitting in this very hall, the world is now watching. You will either be lauded by future generations or vilified by them. Lincoln's words still resonate to all of us here today. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of Earth. That is our charge now. You are the last best hope of Earth. We ask you to protect it, or we and all living things we cherish are history. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the reason why I brought that particular argument up in that video. Now, I understand that Leonardo DiCaprio is not a scientist. I also understand, as you have seen in that video, that he did not present any real facts and figures. But nonetheless, he did present an argument. And it was an argument more or less about proposition of value. He showed the good versus the bad and what needed to be done. He urged off of emotion. And if you look back on chapter 15, he tugged at your heartstrings in order for a push of a need that had to be done when it came to global warming and fossil fuel. And the reason why and if you look back at chapter 15, and he kept on referring to Abraham Lincoln, it was more or less of a patriotic push of what can be done and the good of our country. So he did use logical reasoning, think of it that way as well, but he did not bring in the facts and figures. And he more or less pushed the envelope of trying to persuade you to go one way through value, more so than facts, more so than policy. He was urging policy to be changed, but because he did not have the status to give you an actual policy changed, he used his status of another type of a figure and went in on the basis of value. So you can look at other speeches as well. I probably end up showing more at a later date when it comes to facts and figures and propositions of policy, more so than propositions of fact or value. But those are some things that you need to take into consideration when you start to formulate your persuasive speeches. Chapters 15 did a great job when it came to language and what to do. And chapter 16 talks about how to actually make an argument and how to formulate your pattern. So that way you can get a better idea as to making a claim. Go with the information, and thank you so much.